If you grew up anywhere in Nigeria in the 70s or 80s, you didn't need an invitation to know when music was in town. You would hear it before you saw it. The rolling rhythm of talking drums, the bright shimmer of guitars that seemed to sparkle like sunlight on Lagos Lagoon, the chants that felt both ancient and brand new. And somewhere at the center of that sound, calm, stylish, almost regal, stood King Sunny Adé. But before he became king, before the international tours and Grammy nominations, before the world called him the ambassador of African rhythm, he was simply Sunday Adeniyi, a young boy born into royalty in Ondo State in 1946, a prince by blood but restless by spirit. Imagine the pressure. You are born into a royal family of the Ondo Kingdom. Your lineage is thick with tradition, expectation, responsibility. There are paths already mapped out for you. Respectable paths, political paths, administrative paths, paths that keep the royal bloodline dignified and intact. Music was not that path. In those days, to pursue music seriously was seen by many elders as wandering into uncertainty. Entertainment wasn't yet the glamorous empire it is today. Musicians were admired, yes, but not always respected. It was not a profession you proudly announced at family gatherings if you were from a royal home. But young Sunday heard something others didn't. He heard rhythm in the rain on zinc roofs. He heard melody in market women's chants. He heard poetry in the cadence of Yoruba proverbs. And once that sound gripped him, it refused to let go. Lagos in the late 1950s and early 1960s was buzzing. High-life music drifted from dance halls. Palm wine guitarists played in smoky corners. The city was electric with change. Nigeria was on the brink of independence. There was hope in the air, and there was music in every celebration. Sunday Adeniyi found himself drawn to it like a moth to flame. As a teenager, instead of rehearsing royal protocols, he began sneaking into music rehearsals. Instead of preparing for traditional leadership roles, he was studying guitar chords and drum patterns. He was fascinated by Juju music, the evolving Yoruba sound that mixed talking drums, guitars, and praise poetry. And then came the moment that changed everything. He joined Moses Olaya's band, better known as Babasala, a legend of stage performance. Under Moses Olaya's mentorship, young Sunday learned more than music. He learned stagecraft. He learned how to command a crowd. He learned timing, not just musical timing, but emotional timing. When to let the drums breathe, when to let the guitars cry, when to hold silence so the audience leans in closer. But ambition has a way of whispering louder than comfort. By the mid-1960s, Sunday knew he was ready to carve his own path. He formed his own band, the Green Spots. It was a bold move, risky, almost rebellious. Picture this: a young man from a royal household stepping away from tradition to start a band in a country still finding its identity after independence. It wasn't just a career decision, it was a declaration. The Green Spots didn't sound like everyone else. From the beginning, Sunday, now gradually becoming known as Sunny Adé, experimented with layers. More guitars, multiple percussionists, interwoven rhythms that felt like conversation rather than simple accompaniment. While others were content with straightforward arrangements, Sunny wanted depth. He wanted music that felt like the Yoruba talking drum itself, able to speak, to laugh, to cry, to advise. His stage presence began to grow. He wasn't the loudest man in the room. He didn't need to be. He had a quiet authority. Dressed sharply, often in flowing traditional attire that shimmered under stage lights, he stood at the center like a conductor of a joyful storm. And the audience responded. Weddings, naming ceremonies, society parties, Sunny Adé and the Green Spots became the sound of celebration. His lyrics carried praise for wealthy patrons, yes, but also wisdom. Proverbs woven into melody, cultural memory wrapped in rhythm. Then life tested him. The Nigerian Civil War 1967 to 1970 shook the nation. The entertainment industry, like every other sector, felt the strain. Gigs became uncertain, travel became risky. The country was fractured and musicians had to navigate not just business challenges but emotional ones. But where others might have retreated, Sunny adapted. He refined his sound, he expanded his band, he deepened his compositions. And slowly, as Nigeria began to rebuild after the war, so did his momentum. By the mid-1970s, Juju music was evolving and Sunny Adé was at the forefront. He began introducing pedal steel guitar into his arrangements. That shimmering, almost weeping sound, rare in African music at the time, gave his songs a unique texture. It felt futuristic, yet deeply rooted. It was as if tradition and innovation were dancing together. And audiences couldn't get enough. His records sold across Nigeria and West Africa. His band, now renamed the African Beats, grew larger and more sophisticated. Performances became longer, more elaborate, sometimes 5 hours, sometimes all night. Imagine attending one of those shows. The hall packed, women in gele and asoebi swaying, men nodding with knowing smiles. The drums begin softly, the guitars join, then Sunny steps forward, smiling, calm, confident. He calls out a name in the crowd, a respected businessman. The band shifts, the talking drum mimics speech, praising lineage and achievements. The crowd erupts, money sprays in the air. But beneath the celebration, there's artistry, tight coordination, disciplined musicianship, layered harmonies. Sunny Adé wasn't just entertaining, he was orchestrating culture. And yet, something bigger was forming in his mind. While many artists were content dominating local stages, Sunny Adé began to dream internationally. He listened to global music trends. He studied how artists crossed borders. He understood something powerful. African rhythm did not need to imitate the West to be accepted. It simply needed to be heard. But breaking into the global market in the 1970s was no small feat. Distribution networks were limited. African artists were often boxed into stereotypes. World music as a category barely existed. Still, Sunny believed. He kept refining, kept recording, kept touring, kept building a catalogue so rich that when opportunity knocked, he would be ready. By the end of the 1970s, he wasn't just a Nigerian star, he was a phenomenon. His band was one of the tightest ensembles in Africa. His style, both musical and personal, had become iconic. And somewhere along the way, the young royal who defied expectation had earned a new title, King. Not because he inherited a throne, but because he built one, note by note, rhythm by rhythm. But part one of this story is not about the crown. It's about the courage it took to walk away from comfort. It's about a young man who chose passion over tradition. It's about a young man who believed that the drum could carry his destiny further than tradition ever could. And he was right, because what was coming next would take Sunny Adé beyond Nigeria, beyond Africa, and into a world that had no idea it was about to dance to Juju.
The world was changing faster than anyone in Lagos could keep up. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, music was no longer just about local celebration. Technology was slowly reshaping sound recording. International record labels were beginning to search seriously for unique voices from outside Europe and America. There was a quiet hunger in the global music scene. People were tired of the same patterns, the same rhythms, the same stories told in the same musical language. And somewhere in West Africa, a man was quietly preparing music that would speak without shouting. That man was King Sunny Adé. At this stage of his life, he was no longer just a talented band leader. He was becoming a cultural architect. But greatness does not arrive in silence. It arrives carrying both opportunity and pressure. Nigeria in those years was wrestling with economic uncertainty. Political tension hung in the air like heavy humidity before rain. Many artists struggled to maintain large bands because music production was expensive. Maintaining instruments, paying musicians, organizing tours, all required money and discipline. Sunny's vision was unusual. While others were trimming their bands to survive, he was expanding his. Imagine managing a musical ensemble that sometimes included more than 20 performers. multiple guitarists weaving melodies like threads in a royal fabric, talking drums speaking in Yoruba poetic cadence, percussion sections breathing together like a living organism, and at the center, calm and precise, was Sunny. He was not a showy performer in the way some pop entertainers were. He did not jump wildly across the stage. He did not scream into microphones. Instead, he moved slowly, thoughtfully, almost spiritually. When he raised his guitar, the audience knew something was about to happen. His music was built on patience. In many of his compositions, the introduction could last several minutes before the main vocal line entered. To modern listeners, this might sound unusual, but to those who understood African musical traditions, it felt natural. Because African music, especially Yoruba-influenced forms, is conversational. The drums speak, the guitars answer, the voice joins when the story is ready. Sunny's songs often carried praise poetry, but beneath praise there was philosophy. He sang about dignity, he sang about patience, he sang about success that grows slowly but stands firmly. His stage performances became legendary across Nigeria. People would travel from other cities just to attend his shows. In dance halls, you could feel the vibration of the bass strings under your feet. Women would adjust their head ties gracefully while moving their bodies in subtle rhythm. Men would tap tables quietly as if afraid to disturb the musical spirit in the room. Money was often sprayed in celebration, but Sunny was more interested in musical perfection than spectacle. There were nights when he would rehearse the same section repeatedly until every musician understood not just the notes but the emotion behind them. He believed music was a living language. And then came the international breakthrough. The world outside Africa was beginning to notice African music more seriously in the late 1970s and early 1980s. World music festivals were emerging. Cultural exchange programs were growing. Western audiences were curious about sounds that felt different from rock, disco, or orchestration. Sunny's opportunity came when he began touring outside Africa. The transition was not easy. Imagine arriving in a foreign country where people have never heard your language, never danced to your rhythm, and are not sure what to expect when you step on stage wearing traditional Yoruba attire. Some audiences were skeptical at first. They did not know how to dance to Juju music, but music has a strange power. It bypasses intellectual hesitation and speaks directly to the body. Once the talking drum started its conversation, people began to move, slowly at first, then with more confidence, then with joy. International critics started writing about his sound. They described it as hypnotic, layered, sophisticated. They said it felt traditional and modern at the same time. And the albums kept coming. During this period, Sunny's influence expanded beyond Nigeria. He became one of the faces of African music globally. Young African musicians began studying his arrangements. They watched how he structured band sections, how he balanced percussion with melodic instruments, how he allowed space inside music so that sound could breathe. Because one of Sunny's greatest secrets was understanding silence. Not every moment needs sound. Sometimes the most powerful musical statement is the pause between two notes. On stage, he had a signature calmness. When other band leaders might shout instructions, Sunny communicated through gestures and musical cues. Musicians who worked with him had to be highly disciplined because the music depended on precision. His success also brought cultural pride. For many Africans living abroad, hearing his music felt like hearing home. It reminded them of festivals, of family gatherings, of ancestral stories told under moonlight. But fame carried its own challenges. Managing a large musical organization meant financial responsibilities. Touring internationally meant navigating business negotiations, contracts, and cultural differences. There were times when the industry environment was not always fair to African artists. Distribution channels were sometimes limited. Payment structures were sometimes complicated. Recognition was sometimes slow. Yet, Sunny continued because he believed his mission was bigger than individual comfort. He was preserving a sound that carried generations. His stage outfits became part of his identity. Flowing traditional clothing symbolized dignity and heritage. His appearance was always polished, not flashy in a chaotic way, but royal in presence. People began calling him king, not because he declared himself king, but because audiences felt his authority in music.
And it was not authority born from dominance, it was authority born from mastery. By the mid-1980s, his influence had reached remarkable heights. International music publications started discussing African pop evolution, and Sunny's name was frequently mentioned among the architects of modern African pop music. He even received recognition from Western award platforms. But perhaps more important than awards was the emotional impact he had on everyday listeners. Taxi drivers played his songs during long night drives. Market women played his records while arranging goods. Young couples danced to his music at weddings. Children grew up hearing his guitar melodies drifting from neighbor radios. And through it all, Sunny maintained a disciplined artistic philosophy. He avoided unnecessary musical clutter. He preferred clarity, layered simplicity, rhythm that felt alive but controlled, because he believed greatness was not noise, greatness was balance. However, part 2 of Sunny's journey is not only about success, it is also about the price of staying at the top. Because when a man becomes king of a musical kingdom, storms always come looking for the crown. And the next chapter of his story would test whether the king was built only for applause or also for endurance. Because fame, like thunder, sounds powerful, but sometimes hides the rain that follows. And somewhere in the world, new musical movements were rising, waiting to challenge the legacy he was building.
The world does not stay still for long. Music, like wind across open fields, changes direction without asking permission. By the mid-1980s, new musical movements were rising across the globe. Electronic instruments were becoming more common. Pop music was shifting toward faster production styles. Youth culture was evolving rapidly, and in many parts of the world, attention spans were getting shorter. But in West Africa, one man stood quietly like a mountain, watching clouds pass. That man was King Sunny Adé. At this stage of his life, he was no longer just a musician. He had become a symbol. And symbols are powerful, but they are also fragile, because people do not always separate the symbol from the human being carrying it. The challenge facing Sunny was not just musical competition, it was cultural survival. Juju music was rooted in Yoruba traditional rhythm structures. It was not designed for the fast commercialization wave that was beginning to dominate global entertainment. Young listeners were being pulled toward new sounds. Disco music had swept through many urban dance floors worldwide. Electronic synthesizers were becoming fashionable. Western pop artists were dominating global charts. In Africa itself, younger musicians were experimenting with hybrid sounds, mixing traditional rhythm with modern pop energy. Some critics began asking questions. Was Juju music becoming old-fashioned? Could long instrumental introductions survive in a world where people wanted instant musical gratification? These questions were not spoken loudly around Sunny, but he felt them. Because every artist who reaches a peak eventually faces the silent pressure of relevance. Many musicians in history lose their audience not because they lost talent, but because the world changed faster than their style could adapt. Sunny understood this danger, but he was not interested in abandoning the soul of Juju music. Instead, he chose evolution without betrayal. He studied modern recording techniques. He experimented with sound mixing. He allowed subtle improvements in production quality without destroying the organic nature of his music. Think of it like polishing an ancient sculpture without reshaping the original form. The talking drum still spoke Yoruba poetry. The guitar still shimmered slowly like sunlight reflecting on river water. The rhythm still moved in circles of cultural memory. But the sound became cleaner, sharper, and more globally accessible. International tours became more demanding during this period. Sunny's band was large compared to many contemporary groups. Managing travel logistics for such a team required discipline. Airline schedules, equipment transportation, accommodation coordination, musical rehearsal synchronization, every detail mattered because one weak performance could damage reputation built over decades. Audiences outside Africa were fascinated by his stage presence.
In Europe and North America, people who had never danced to African traditional rhythm found themselves swaying unconsciously when the music began. It was not just entertainment, it was cultural education wrapped in melody. Critics often described his concerts as spiritual experiences rather than simple performances. The band would begin softly. Percussion would enter like footsteps approaching slowly across sand. Guitars would weave melodic patterns. Then Sunny would step forward, not dramatically, not shouting, just presence. There was something deeply royal about the way he carried himself on stage. Not royal in a political sense, royal in emotional authority. Like a storyteller who had walked long distances and now speaks with calm wisdom. But fame also brought business realities. The international music industry in the 1980s was complex for African artists. Distribution channels were often controlled by large foreign companies. Negotiations were sometimes difficult. Royalties were sometimes delayed. Sunny had to learn the business side of music quickly because talent alone was no longer enough. He needed strategy. He needed legal awareness. He needed financial management. And he needed trusted partners. This period of his life was not always publicly visible. While fans saw performances, behind the scenes there were negotiations, contracts, and decisions that determined the sustainability of his musical empire. Maintaining a large band also meant constant training. Musicians working with Sunny had to understand precision. If one guitar line entered too early, the emotional balance of the composition could be disrupted. If percussion timing drifted, the entire musical conversation could collapse. So rehearsal discipline was strict. But there was also mentorship. Many young musicians who worked with him learned professionalism from observing how he handled pressure. He taught by example, not necessarily through speeches, through consistency. Meanwhile, African identity in global music was becoming more discussed in academic and cultural spaces. People were beginning to recognize that African musical systems were sophisticated communication structures. Sunny's work became part of that conversation. Scholars studied how Yoruba rhythm patterns reflected linguistic tonal structures. They analyzed how talking drums could mimic speech inflections. They examined how repetition in Juju music created trance-like emotional engagement. And through all these discussions, Sunny remained focused on making music that people could feel before they analyzed, because he believed music should touch the heart first. Another interesting aspect of this period was fashion. Sunny's stage clothing became part of his artistic identity. Traditional flowing garments symbolized dignity, cultural pride, and continuity with ancestral heritage. He did not chase Western stage fashion trends aggressively. Instead, he modernized traditional aesthetics subtly. The result was a visual signature that audiences immediately recognized. People didn't just hear Sunny's music. They saw it, they felt it, they remembered it. But no story of greatness is complete without mentioning challenges. There were moments when musical sales fluctuated. There were moments when touring schedules were exhausting. There were moments when industry attention shifted toward newer pop stars. For an artist who had dominated earlier decades, this could be emotionally difficult. But Sunny's philosophy was long-term. He was not trying to win every season. He was trying to build legacy. Legacy is different from popularity. Popularity is loud. Legacy is persistent. And persistence was one of Sunny's strongest characteristics. Even when media attention shifted, he continued performing, recording, and refining his sound. Fans who understood Juju music remained loyal. Older generations passed the music to younger ones. In many Yoruba communities, his songs became part of social memory. They were played during celebrations, during cultural festivals, during important life ceremonies, because the music carried history inside rhythm. By the late 1980s, international recognition reached a remarkable point. He became one of the most globally visible African musicians of his generation. Young African artists looked up to him not just as a performer, but as a pioneer. His career demonstrated that African traditional music could stand confidently on the world stage without losing authenticity. And yet, despite global fame, there was something remarkably humble about his stage behavior. He rarely rushed performances. He allowed music to breathe. He respected the audience's emotional journey. He treated rhythm as conversation rather than command. If you watched him closely during concerts, you would notice something interesting. He listened to his band members while performing, sometimes nodding, sometimes adjusting tempo subtly. Leadership in music, he believed, was collective, not authoritarian. The band was like a musical family. Each instrument had a voice, each musician had responsibility, and Sunny was the conductor of emotional harmony. As part 3 closes, the story is not yet finished, because kings are often tested not only by competition, but by time itself. The 1990s would bring new challenges, new technologies, new generations of listeners, new cultural expectations, and the question that history always asks of great artists: can the king remain relevant when the world grows younger and faster?
Time changes everyone. Even the strongest rhythms must face the long walk of years. By the 1990s, the musical world had transformed dramatically. Digital technology was entering recording studios. Younger listeners were discovering new genres that moved faster, spoke louder, and followed different cultural expressions. The global entertainment industry was becoming more commercialized, more visually driven, and more impatient with long musical introductions. For an artist whose style was built on layered instrumentation, patience, and conversational rhythm, this was a critical historical moment. At this stage of life, the legendary career of King Sunny Adé was no longer measured only by album sales or concert attendance. It was measured by legacy. Because legacy is what remains when the crowd grows older, when fashion changes, when technology evolves, and when new stars rise to replace old lights. Sunny understood something many artists struggle to accept. Music is both eternal and temporary. The notes can live forever, but the social attention surrounding them can fade. So he shifted focus. Instead of chasing popularity trends, he concentrated on preservation and mentorship. He became more interested in protecting Juju music as a cultural heritage than competing for chart dominance. During this period, he invested energy in training younger musicians. Many young instrumentalists who joined his musical organization learned discipline first. Rehearsal schedules were strict, timing precision was emphasized, respect for musical space was taught. Sunny believed that talent without discipline was like a beautiful drum with broken skin. It may look good but cannot speak properly. He encouraged young musicians to study not only music but also culture, history, language, poetry. Because Juju music was never just entertainment, it was storytelling, it was social memory, it was philosophy carried inside melody. Meanwhile, global recognition of African music was slowly growing. World music festivals invited African legends more frequently, cultural exchange programs became more common, African diaspora communities abroad treated concerts by veteran African artists as emotional reunions with homeland memory. When Sunny performed internationally, many older African immigrants attended his concerts with deep emotional connection. Some closed their eyes while dancing slowly, not because they were showing off, but because the music reminded them of childhood sounds, village festivals, family gatherings, market celebrations, traditional ceremonies under open sky. Sunny's music carried homesickness inside rhythm, and that is one of the quiet powers of great art. It can carry people back to places they cannot physically return to.
As the 2000s approached, the music industry entered the internet age. Digital distribution began how people consumed music. Younger audiences discovered songs through computers and later mobile technology. Shorter music clips became popular. Visual presentation became more important. Some critics wondered whether traditional long-form Juju music could survive in this new environment, but Sunny did not panic. He believed cultural art forms do not die simply because technology changes. They survive when they are carried by new generations. He supported younger African artists who were experimenting with modern fusion sounds. He did not view musical evolution as betrayal. He viewed it as natural growth, like a tree whose branches extend further while roots remain deep in soil. In interviews during his later years, he often spoke about patience. He advised young artists not to rush success. He told them that greatness is not loud arrival, but consistent presence. He spoke about humility, about cultural responsibility, about protecting African musical heritage. Beyond music, Sunny's life also reflected leadership through example. He avoided unnecessary public controversy, he maintained professional discipline, he focused on artistic contribution rather than social media drama, which was beginning to dominate entertainment discussions in the early digital age. As he aged, his performances became slightly less physically demanding, but emotionally deeper. Fans noticed something beautiful. His stage presence became calmer, more reflective, like an elder storyteller speaking slowly under moonlight. The guitar melody still shimmered, the talking drum still spoke, but there was now a sense of wisdom inside the rhythm. People did not just dance, they listened more carefully, because the music felt like life experience transformed into sound. International recognition continued. Cultural institutions honored his contribution to world music. African music scholars referenced his career when discussing modern African popular music evolution. He became not just an entertainer, but a cultural ambassador, a bridge between traditional African musical philosophy and global contemporary music understanding. One of the most powerful aspects of his legacy was influence. Many modern African musicians, even those who perform different genres, carry subtle echoes of Juju musical structure in their work. This is how great artistic traditions survive, not through imitation, but through inspiration. Children who never attended his concerts still hear traces of his musical style in modern African pop evolution. And that is immortality in art. Not statues, not awards alone, but living influence. Today, people remember him as more than a musician. They remember him as a cultural custodian, a pioneer who showed that African traditional music could stand proudly on global stages, a man who built musical bridges across generations, and a prince who followed a different kind of throne. Not a political throne, not a royal palace throne, but the throne of rhythm, the throne of culture, the throne of memory carried inside melody. Because long after microphones go silent, long after concert lights fade, and long after audiences go home, music that touches human spirit continues to live. And that is the story of a king who did not rule with swords or crowns, but with guitars, drums, patience, and the heartbeat of Africa itself. The legend of Sunny Adé is not just about music. It is about believing that culture can travel through time and that rhythm can carry history, identity, and hope into the future. And maybe somewhere tonight, if you listen carefully to the soft shimmer of Juju guitar in the distance, you might hear the king still playing, not on a stage, but inside the living memory of African sound.